We're always looking for answers to our huge economic problems: inequality, instability. What if we've been looking in all the wrong places? What if the real answers aren't in some dense economic textbook, but somewhere, well, completely different? Today, we're going to dive into a pretty radical blueprint for a global economy. And this one isn't based on policy papers, it's grounded in spiritual principles. It's a fascinating idea, and it all starts with a very honest look at where we are right now. And this really sets the stage. We can well perceive how the whole human race is encompassed with incalculable afflictions. Wow. I mean, that's a heavy statement, but doesn't it feel true? There's this sense everywhere that we're in a deep crisis. And the whole idea of this framework is that to even begin to think about a solution, we have to get the diagnosis right. We've got to understand what the real problem is first. All right, so let's look at that diagnosis: a world in crisis. The source material for this, it doesn't pull any punches. It says, look, before we can talk about a cure, we have to admit just how sick the patient is. And get this, for description, the world isn't just described as sick, it's called a moribund organism. I mean, think about what that means. Moribund. That's not just sick, that's on its deathbed. It's this image of a living thing that's being torn apart by politics and literally strangled by an economy that's just completely out of control.
So what are the symptoms of this dying organism? Well, there are things we see on the news every single day, right? We're talking about racial hatred flaring up, total confusion about the economy, lawlessness and terrorism on the rise. We've got this return to militarism, this obsession with just stuff, with gross materialism. And of course, that massive, massive gap between the super rich and the desperately poor. The key takeaway here is that these aren't separate problems. The framework sees them as all being symptoms of the same deep underlying sickness.
Okay, so what is the sickness? What's the root cause? This is where this whole approach really veers away from your typical economic or political analysis. It says, hold on, all that stuff we just listed, the racism, the poverty, the wars, those are just the symptoms. The real disease, it argues, is something much deeper. It's an internal problem. And here it is, the core problem. The big diagnosis is that our crisis is, at its heart, spiritual. The argument is that the whole mess we're in isn't fundamentally about money or politics. It's a crisis of the human spirit. That our worldview, our whole outlook on life, has just become way too crude, too focused on material things. We've lost the plot, basically. And this really gets to the heart of it. The framework makes this really clear distinction between two kinds of happiness. You've got material happiness, which, it feels good for a minute, but it's temporary, it's limited. The text even calls it like an illusion. It just feeds our bodily wants. Then you have spiritual happiness, and that's described as eternal, unfathomable, the real foundation of life. And the diagnosis is that we, as a society, have been chasing the illusion and forgetting all about the real deal. This quote here really sums up the diagnosis: the gross materialism that engulfs the entire nation, the attachment to worldly things that enshrouds the souls of men. It's that attachment, that obsession with stuff, that's seen as the thing blinding us, stopping us from fixing our real problems. So, okay, if that's the disease, what on earth is the cure? Well, the remedy is actually built on one single, incredibly powerful idea, a kind of core operating principle that's meant to heal that moribund organism we mentioned earlier. And here it is. The Earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. Just let that sink in for a second. It's a complete shift in how we see ourselves. Not as Americans or Russians or Chinese, not as members of this group or that tribe, but as citizens of one single shared world. It sounds simple, but the implications, they are absolutely huge. And this is really important. This isn't just some nice, fluffy, feel-good quote. It's presented as an actual, practical, operating principle, something to guide our decisions right now. And it's also the ultimate goal we're working towards. And what it implies is an organic change, which is a big deal. We're not talking about just tinkering around the edges of our current system. We're talking about a complete transformation of how society is structured. So what does that look like in the real world? If you actually take this idea of oneness seriously, what happens? Well, according to the source material, it means you have to demolish economic barriers. It means countries start putting the needs of all humanity before their own national interests. You'd need a single code of international law. You'd have to recognize that capital and labor are totally dependent on each other. And you'd have to completely, utterly extinguish racial animosity. These are the direct, practical outcomes of that one single principle.
Okay, so from that huge guiding principle of oneness, we then get a much more specific economic blueprint. This is where the big spiritual idea starts to look like a practical plan for how we handle money, wealth, and poverty.
Let's break down the key principles of this new economy. First up is moderation. The idea here is simple. No super abnormally rich people and no one living in abject poverty. It's about finding a balance. Then there's profit sharing. This is huge. It means employees are treated like actual partners in the business, getting a share of the profits on top of their wages. Third, voluntary giving. The wealthy are encouraged to help the poor, but out of their own free will and sense of responsibility, not because they're forced to. And finally, and this is a big one, education. It's called the primary, most urgent requirement for any nation to succeed. You put these all together, and you get the foundations for a much more balanced and just economy. So how does this work on a local level, like in your town or village? The blueprint proposes something called the village storehouse. Think of it like a community chest or a local economic hub. It's funded by a few different sources from the community, like a percentage of the harvest, taxes on animals, things like that. Then a local committee manages the funds to take care of everyone's needs. We're talking about caring for the sick, for orphans, funding schools, making sure public health is good. And the goal is crystal clear. In that village, nobody goes hungry, nobody is without clothes, nobody is in want.
Okay, a shift this big, it sounds almost impossible, right? But what's fascinating is that the source material doesn't present this as some far-off utopia. It's framed as something else entirely, as a natural, even inevitable step in our evolution as a species. This is such a cool way to look at it. All the chaos and crisis in the world today, what if that's not the world ending, but just humanity going through a really rough and turbulent adolescence? This whole transformation is seen as humanity's coming of age. We're finally growing up. And it's not just another phase, it's described as the last and highest stage in our evolution as a collective. It's our final step into adulthood. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to this one fundamental point. You can't separate the inner and the outer. You just can't reshape our world, our economies, our governments, without also reshaping our inner lives. The outward stuff only changes if we have an inward change of heart first. That's the absolute starting point for everything else. So, that leaves us with a really powerful, maybe even uncomfortable question to think about. We're so used to trying to fix economic problems with economic solutions, right? More regulations, different policies, but this entire blueprint forces us to ask something different. If our global economy really is sick, and if that sickness is, at its root, a spiritual one, then could a spiritual remedy be the only cure that will actually work?